Welcome to the About the Face podcast, sponsored by the American Academy of Facial Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery through the Facial Plastic Surgery and Aesthetic Medicine Journal. My name is Dr. Peter Vila, and I'm a facial plastic surgeon in Portland, Oregon, specializing in facial rejuvenation and rhinoplasty. In episode 38 of this podcast, released back in late 2024, I had the pleasure of speaking with the authors of the article entitled Limited Delamination Modifications to the Extended Deep Plane Rhytidectomy, or what has very quickly become known as the preservation facelift. On this episode, they told us about how the technique came to be, and there were some differences of opinion among the authors in terms of what to call their new technique. Dr. Mike Nyack, a facial plastic surgeon in St. Louis, Missouri, was the first to use the term preservation facelift while discussing his specific approach at a course in Istanbul, Turkey. I was lucky enough to be in attendance at this course, and what he did was extend the same philosophy of preserving tissue and minimizing dissection when possible, just like the idea of preservation rhinoplasty, to his facelift technique. As discussed in the previous episode, the other authors on the paper had all independently begun incorporating similar modifications to their technique over time. The consensus in the manuscript as published was that they would call the technique the limited delamination modification, which admittedly is a bit of a mouthful. They mentioned the phrase preservation facelift only one time in the entire manuscript. Dr. Richard Gentile, a facial plastic surgeon in northeastern Ohio, wrote a letter to the editor about this paper.
My personal experience over the past 2 weeks is that from Newport Beach to Texas to Athens, Greece, we're seeing everybody now hashtag preservation facelift. And so, that was happening about as I wrote the letter, but why are we doing this? I mean, it's not a true preservation procedure in the minimally invasive approach to things. When we say preservation, doing a level 4 deep plane dissection all the way is not really preserving much.
Here's Dr. Mike Roskies, a facial plastic surgeon in Toronto and the lead author of the original manuscript.
We very consciously omitted the term preservation facelift from the original paper because of the fact that we knew that this subset of the population existed that would focus more on the name over the substance of the paper. And we didn't want that to be the point of contention that they could take. And so we took out preservation, except for one point made in the conclusion of the paper, so that the results, the anatomy, the philosophy would speak for itself. And over the course of the last year and a half that many of us have been speaking all over the world about it, other people in the audience have been calling it preservation facelift. It makes sense. It speaks to the preservation of the fibrous septae, the biomechanical strength of the face and the lateral septal band. So we're still at this point now where I'm uncomfortable attributing the name to the technique. I think that we let the public and those who use it decide.
Dr. Gentile believes the use of the term preservation facelift could be misleading.
You preserve your skin attachment. And, if that's what it's about, just based on that, I think that can potentially, mislead people into thinking, oh, this is a not so drastic kind of facelift. And so that's why I think choosing terms should be approached. And of course, we saw the last renaming of a procedure of preservation was renaming the push down and let down rhinoplasty surgeons, which are all of a sudden preservation rhinoplasty. And then you sit through a lecture and you hear everybody saying, well, maybe this isn't really a good name, but they're calling it that. And actually, in some preservation rhinoplasties, due to the ronduring of bone and an additional osteotomy, it's less preservation than the original ones that don't preserve the keystone and the scroll ligaments and things like that.
When I asked Dr. Roskies about this was his response.
As far as preservation rhinoplasty is concerned, I've been doing it exclusively for the last 6.5 years in my practice. I have over 1,000 cases of preservation rhinoplasty. I would never consider myself to be an expert in any of these topics, but I do have a little bit of experience to speak to when it comes to it. Petange's ligament, first of all, is intrinsically related to the scroll ligament. It's just an extension of it. We know that preserving Petange's ligament is not the key to preservation rhinoplasty. In fact, if you preserve it, we've all had this. It can actually lead to a deepened supratip break, which is one of the downsides of doing so. So, as is the case for facelift surgery, when it comes to rhinoplasty, ligament preservation is just one part of the story. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to preserve the positive anatomical features of every nose so that we can create the most subtle and natural results for our patients. He was trying to minimize our experience as a means to devalue the statements that we made with regards to facelift surgery. That's fine. I mean, he doesn't know who I am. I don't really know him very well, but I can only speak to my experience with my patients. And now having done quite a few of these, I recognize the beauty of preservation rhinoplasty. And I also will say, like, nobody from the beginning, when the first textbook was written, argued against using that term, preservation rhinoplasty, because it made sense. It was very descriptive. I think results matter most. And when senior authors of our paper say that adopting the preservation philosophy has improved their results more than anything else in the last 20 years of their practice, and they're already great in those first 20 years, this is when people start to pay attention.
One of the main critiques from the letter to the editor was that coming up with a new name for the procedure was mainly for marketing and makes it more difficult for patients to understand what is being done. I asked Dr. Gentile about the multiple terms he has created for his facelift techniques, including the Tesla facelift.
Yeah, the Tesla, and that turned into Tesla because we called it hybrid for a number of years, because hybrid is, you're using some technology, you're doing some surgery, and then just I thought that hybrid, it's been used in a lot of different names, so I wanted to develop something that was a little more unique. And Tesla, basically, Nikola Tesla. It's not to be confused with the car, especially at this point, since the car is so incredibly unpopular in some circles. But Tesla wanted to electrify everything. He wanted you to be able to get electrical current wirelessly. And so, the Tesla adaptation, again, is not to be trendy, but it was just that he wanted to electrify and add energy to the world, and I want to add it to facelifts. And so that's how that started.
I then asked Dr. Gentile what was different about him naming alternative facelift procedures, as opposed to what the authors have done in their manuscript.
I think that's a very good question, because I looked at it that way. Because if in fact, I mentioned Dr. Bill Little before, and he had all kinds of kind of different kind of names, like an XT or XJ, and but it described to him exactly what he was doing. So like that's how he remembered, if he charted it or whatever, I did exactly this, I did that. And so in the course of innovating, when you're doing something that's not, just strict and standard, remember to document it in a certain way makes you remember exactly what you did. So yeah, like the AccuSmaz describes, that, with what Ben does, the sailboat tells you exactly, part of his access to, the deep plane flap, and everybody has a little term that they can do. But preservation, to me, it just came too close on the tails of the preservation rhinoplasty. And it's like, we already have a name for this. It's called composite, deep plane. So that to me tells me exactly what the surgeon's done. When you put preservation in there, I don't know what the surgeon's doing. I don't know if they're placating and they call that a preservation or what. And in fact, in some cases, I've used preservation neck lift because I don't cut any skin. I don't make any skin excisions in the upper lip. So to me, that's more of a preservation procedure because we're preserving all the skin.
Here's Dr. Roskies again on why they decided explicitly not to call it the preservation facelift and instead opted for the limited delamination modification approach.
What the senior authors of the paper, myself included, not that I'm a gray-haired senior author at all, took issue with was, none of what we're talking about is marketing. The name preservation was mentioned once in the entire article. We're calling it limited delamination for a reason, because We really want to emphasize the scientific and anatomical benefits to the technique. But the fact that the senior author really latched on to that aspect means that people are talking about it and it has gained traction, not because of the marketing ability of the name, mostly because surgeons have now tried it and they're recognizing the benefits for their own patients.
We'd like to thank the authors for their commentary and thank you for listening to our podcast. If you'd like to explore more, please feel free to check out the article in print at the Facial Plastic Surgery and Aesthetic Medicine Journal or online. We'll catch you on the next one.